many individuals, it is very underrated. And some of these individuals might be aging individuals. They tend to have more mitochondrial dysfunction. Individuals who use a lot of energy, they burn a lot of energy in the mitochondria. For example, someone doing very vigorous exercise or individuals taking a statin. Of course, if you meet all three of these criteria, you are a perfect candidate.
Let's start with CoQ10. So I hear a lot about mitochondrial dysfunction. No one seems to be able to explain exactly what that is, but CoQ10 helps that. So why isn't everybody taking it?
Yeah, so mitochondrial dysfunction, there is a lot of things to think about. One of them is age, how your proteins are folding. One is how your nutrients are crossing the mitochondria membrane. It's actually a double membrane. The carnitine palmitoyl coenzyme A shuttle actually helps shuttle nutrients across, specifically certain types of fatty acids. But there's also an enzyme called coenzyme Q10, and that helps convert NAD plus to ATP, which is cellular energy. And then to tie it together, creatine can help be another donor for energy to make ATP with creatine phosphate. But to kind of get back to the underrated, overrated aspect of CoQ10, we do think it is a little bit underrated. In some spheres, it might be a bit overrated, but in many individuals, it is very underrated. And some of these individuals might be aging individuals. They tend to have more mitochondrial dysfunction. Individuals who use a lot of energy, they burn a lot of energy in the mitochondria. For example, someone doing very vigorous exercise or individuals taking a statin. Of course, if you meet all three of these criteria, you are a perfect candidate for taking coenzyme Q10.
So is coenzyme Q10 like a octane booster for your fuel? And if we're looking at the different things that plug into, the Krebs cycle, right, creating cellular energy, the mitochondrial function, why wouldn't I just take more B12? Because that's on the list as well, as opposed to taking just coenzyme Q10.
It can be the rate limiting step. So if you think about the process of fuel, to oversimplify it, sometimes we make the analogy like a Formula One car. So you have the fuel pump, and carnitine, the shuttle, is one of those fuel pumps. You also have the backup fuel tank, that's creatine. You have the pre-fuel, that's like NMN, NR, even niacin to some degree, but especially NAD+. And the fuel activator is CoQ10. So you can get what's called an NAD depletion myalgia. And there's a lot of ways to cure that. Just niacin will cure an NAD depletion myalgia. But if you have a CoQ10 depletion myalgia, of which we know that statins decrease CoQ10, then only that last rate limiting step will fix it.
So maybe if your CoQ10 is the rate limiting step, you're running on 6 cylinders instead of 8 because your spark plugs aren't firing.
Yeah, something like that. Of note with CoQ10, a lot of clinicians and scientists will bring up the studies that were done on dual drugs. So I assume that these were like phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. I don't remember exactly which phase they were in. But pharmaceutical companies certainly looked at combining statins with CoQ10. But like any other study, there's a selection bias. And the selection bias that they wanted for those studies is the general population, because when you have a drug, you want to be able to market it to ideally everyone. But if not everyone, every person that would be taking a statin otherwise, that seems reasonable. If they had selected for individuals who are only over a certain age and only doing a certain amount of exercise, so a lot of exercise, then it's theoretically would have been much more likely to have good results in these trials.
In another subgroup they were looking at, specifically, I think this is mentioned in the Merck patent, is individuals with congestive heart failure, because a lot of times someone has a heart attack, they lose some of their cardiovascular function, lose some of the ejection fraction, and then those individuals are placed on a statin to greatly reduce their risk of having another heart attack. And adding coenzyme Q10 into there would be really a no-brainer if someone has reduced cardiac output, because there are some studies that specifically look at that and they see some improvements. It's not going to reverse someone's advanced end-stage heart failure, but it will shift things in the right direction in a small way.
Like many other things, we do like to check CoQ10 levels and then see where things stack up. Anecdotally, and there's not, hopefully they will research this more, but anecdotally, individuals who have very beneficial lipoprotein profiles, or they don't have any issues with cholesterol, they have very low LDL at baseline, not on any meds, very low ApoB at baseline, perhaps they have a mutation in PCSK9 or LDL receptor or whatever the case may be, or just less HMGC or reductase activity. I've seen several of these individuals with very low CoQ10 levels at baseline, which is, I suppose, maybe a little bit, it makes sense physiologically because you're essentially just genetically predisposed to be in a statin-like state.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I suppose the trend that I've seen, I don't know that I've seen a correlation or enough of these to kind of point in the direction of lower lipids and less coenzyme Q10, but certainly as people increase in age, I've seen much lower levels, sometimes even actually flagged as low by the laboratory, where it's still a pretty broad range. Usually goes from about 0.5 to 2 or sometimes even higher. And some of these people are off the charts low in their serum coenzyme Q10, which doesn't tell us the full story, but I would suspect all other things equal, someone with a low serum level compared to someone with a serum level of 3 would stand to benefit from coenzyme Q10. And I don't know if this is being looked at in some of the studies that are done, like what someone's starting coenzyme Q10 is. So there's a lot of very niche individualized studies that we would love to see done or love to do someday, but I don't believe the results are out there yet. If someone does find one of those, please send them our way because I would love to see that.
Definitely. We're always trying to find new studies. I would say a day probably doesn't go by without us wanting to see or looking for a study on a very specific group of individuals. Often the niche is too small. And unfortunately, often the study group that we want to see is individuals who exercise a lot, especially in older age, which is exceedingly hard to find given that there's just not that many people doing that in this country.
And that's the opposite trend you would tend to see with aging. Even among those who are in this sort of above average or elite fitness categories, they tend to still have a decrease in their activity levels as they increase age, especially in older age. And that's the question that a lot of people have is like, is this sort of sarcopenia and loss of aerobic capacity entirely aging, or is there some component of this decreased activity that is leading to that? Because you really have to have perhaps not as much for the sarcopenia, the muscle mass and the strength, but for aerobic capacity, the time investment is going to be pretty proportional to the increase in aerobic capacity you have up until you reach sort of the elite status, which takes a ton of time per week to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And hopefully more research into anti-aging. I saw a poll, by the way. Where should the most money in research go? Cancer, diabetes, or anti-aging? And cancer got the most votes, which is, I guess, somewhat reasonable. Diabetes got the least number of votes. But anti-aging got a decent number of votes. But what does that really even mean? So what we just described, that's kind of what it means to us.